Hi, and welcome to our roundtable on Indigenous Florida. We are so glad to have all of you here with us today, and we wish we could be together, but this is going to have to do. We're not going to give a land acknowledgement today, but we think that our panel should serve as an extended one. It works on the premise that Florida was and continues to be Indigenous space, that many Indigenous people have called and continue to call Florida home, and that the history of Florida is inherently a colonial one, a history where the forced dispossession of lands has been endemic. We hope that this panel and the papers from which they come continue to rebuild a new vision of the past and help us to create a better future. And here is a good place for me to say that the papers that we're talking about today come from the 100th issue of the Florida Historical Quarterly, which has just been published on Indigenous Florida. And Andrea, Frank, and I put this issue together and recruited 4 wonderful scholars who are part of a new generation who are rewriting the history of Florida by centering Indigenous people. And so today we're going to share a wonderful discussion with these 4 scholars and together think about what Indigenous Florida's history looks like today and what it might look like in the future too.
So once upon a time, scholars of early Florida focused almost exclusively on those places where Spaniards and then Englishmen and sometimes Frenchmen lived. Early Florida and St. Augustine were almost synonymous. Indigenous people hardly appeared at all in our stories until they entered a colonial town or a mission, or if they resisted European expansion or other ambitions. The same tale taught us that these Indigenous people all died out, the victims of disease, war, and slave raids. Florida would not be empty for long, the tale goes, as the Florida Seminoles replaced the ancient peoples who lived in the state. Their history, though, would play an important but really chronologically segregated place in the state's history, one that was almost exclusively confined to the era of the long Seminole War. As many of us know, similar fantasies have been told about the United States. For generations, scholars equated early America with the Puritans or even the Pilgrim story. They hardly left New England at all. And when they did, they ventured all the way south to the Chesapeake, hugging the coast of a different English coastal colony. In these contexts, Indigenous people remained remarkably rare, serving as the oppositional force to what was seen as the inevitability of westward expansion. There too, Indigenous people seemed to disappear when white colonists and settlers arrived. As most of you probably know, the academy shifted a couple generations ago, if not longer. Popular perceptions, however, remain focused on New England, but thanks to Karen Wolf and others, we routinely now talk about a vast early America. Some still imagine, though, Indigenous people disappearing, but slowly these falsehoods are being corrected and a new, fuller history is being told. Today, our goal is to speak directly to you, whether secondary school teachers, public historians, academics, or just lovers of Florida history. And we want to begin or to continue to retell the history of Florida in ways that are not simply ones that follow the preponderance of paper. The bulk of sources, the most literate people don't necessarily have claims on the most of our history.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So we're going to start discussing some of the crucial issues at the heart of Indigenous Florida's history with our panelists. And the first panelist we're going to talk to today is Aubrey Lauersdorf. And I'm going to introduce each panelist right before they speak, before they answer one big question, and then we're going to continue to engage in a conversation centered around key questions that we've already told the presenters about. So Aubrey Lauersdorf is an assistant professor of history at Auburn University. She received her PhD from the University of North Carolina in 2020. Her current book project is tentatively entitled Apalachee Coast, Indigenous Power in the Colonial Gulf South. Aubrey is talking to us today about an article that she's written and just published in the Florida Historical Quarterly entitled An Apalachee Revolt, Reconceptualizing Violence in 17th Century Apalachee. So Dr. Lauersdorf, the first question that we're asking our scholars to think about today is what your article tells us and your book project that it comes from, what it tells us about the history of Florida. What are the big picture issues, and what, for a non-specialist, would you want them to know and to take away from your work?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about this piece, and so excited to see it come out in the Florida Historical Quarterly. So the piece I contributed to this is comes from my larger book manuscript that will be published in the next few years. Not sure exactly when yet, but so this piece, again, as Dr. Bossy said, is an Apalachee revolt reconceptualizing violence in 17th century Apalachee. And really what I'm trying to do here and in this larger project is sort of re-examine a part of Florida that has had some previous attention paid to it, but has not really had the full Indigenous history sort of brought out here. So I'm looking at an incident called the Apalachee Revolt in 1647. And this is really an incident in which the Apalachees killed many of the Spaniards in their territory and pushed the rest of them out. They burned down the handful of missions that had been built there. And this is really understood as a rejection of Spanish dominance. It has been seen by scholars for a very long time as the Apalachees getting frustrated that the Spaniards have really seized power over them and trying to get rid of them. But what I really found looking at the sources on this is that there's a lot in the historical context of this incident to raise some questions about this interpretation. Really, when we look at Apalachee territory in this period, there's almost no Spaniards there. There are really fewer than 20 Spaniards in this entire territory that is sort of surrounding the area that is now Tallahassee. And of these Spaniards, there's almost no soldiers whatsoever. And we also find that in the aftermath of this incident, there is further conflict between the Apalachee Indians and the Timucua Indians, who are their immediate Indigenous neighbors. So sort of these two things happening around this so-called revolt really raise questions to me about whether this is truly a rejection of Spanish dominance in the territory. And I found that there is, in fact, something much more complicated going on here. This is much more part of a larger Indigenous story. Would you like me to go into a little more about that, or should I save that for a bit later in our session?
No, I think this is the perfect place.
Wonderful. Great. Yeah. So really, what I found by sort of trying to step back from this Spanish-centered narrative, which is, of course, what we're finding in the sources, right? The sources are entirely written by Spaniards related to this incident. So if we step back from the Spanish-centered narrative and try to sort of position ourselves in Apalachee and think about what are the people here worried about, what are their goals, what are their motivations at this time, we find that this is part of a much more meaningful internal conflict among Apalachee people, really, who are trying to answer some very serious questions about what they want their future to be as a polity, how they see themselves positioned in this broader region of alliances and enmities. And so what happened about 15 years before this revolt is the first friars came to Apalachee territory. And as part of this, we see a number of Apalachee chiefs really taking concerted efforts to establish very, very close relationships with the Spaniards. The Apalachees had made peace with the Spaniards in 1608, a few decades before this, but nothing had really come of this for the first 25 years or so. But by the 1630s, we see Apalachee chiefs really making demands on the Spaniards. They want friars to come to their territory. They are helping the Spaniards find a port off of their coast. They're even helping the Spaniards build a farm on the border of Apalachee. So this farm is not in Apalachee, but it is near its border. And what I really found in my research is that there are a few chiefs out of 40 in total that are almost wholeheartedly involved in this, while the others are not. So there's this very small group of chiefs who are pushing for a closer relationship with the Spaniards. They're actually trying to bring the Spaniards into their territory. There really is not evidence that this is being forced on them. It is clear that they are participants, they are active in this process. And what I really found is that these chiefs were able to augment their authority relative to other Apalachee chiefs through their relationships with the Spaniards, as well as with some of these other polities like the Timucuas. So what we start to see is that by actually bringing their Spanish allies to them, by making their Spanish allies dependent on their land to access a port and a farm, these chiefs are really able to get what they want out of the Spaniards. And over the years, this starts to create an incredible power imbalance within Apalachee itself. We have this small group of chiefs who can pretty much leverage what they want from these allies, and a whole bunch of other chiefs who are feeling increasingly disadvantaged. And so we start to find that by the mid-1640s, some of these disadvantaged chiefs are really ready to make a change. They're ready to put an end to this power imbalance. And so what I found is that this 1647 revolt was a lot more like a coup. This was an attempt by a contingent of chiefs to seize power from these handful of their brethren who had become so influential by cultivating close relationships with these allies. They were ultimately unsuccessful. The Spaniards were able to return. And the reason I find that they could return is that their allies in Apalachee, these chiefs that they had been working closely with for well over a decade, asked for their assistance. They wanted them there. They wanted them to come and help these chiefs reassert power. And so that's exactly what happened. These chiefs had to give actually very little up out of this. They were able to maintain control of their towns. They maintained a close alliance with the Spanish, and they used the relationship they cultivated over these many years to get Spanish support when they needed it. So this sort of attempted coup ultimately failed. But again, by looking at this, taking a step away from the Spanish perspective, decentering the Spaniards, we really see this much more complicated story, this really indigenous-centered conflict happening instead of a revolt, if you will. So I will end there and sort of pass it off to our next participant.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lauersdorf. I could come up with about 10 questions to ask you right now because it sparked so many thoughts, but I want to make sure we listen to everyone first. And then if we have time, I have several questions I could certainly ask. So our next presenter is Jason Herbert, who's an ethnographer for Seminole Heritage Services and a doctoral candidate at the University of Minnesota. He is about to defend his dissertation, Beast of Many Names, Cattle Conflict and the Transformation of Indigenous Florida, 1519 to 1858. And the piece that he's published in the Florida Historical Quarterly builds on this work. His dissertation examines social, political, and environmental transformations and changes in Florida from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Today, he's going to be talking with us about his article, We Have Always Been Cow People, Alachua Seminole Identity and Autonomy, 1750 to 1776. So almost Dr. Herbert, I'm going to ask you the same question. For the non-specialist, what does your paper tell us specifically about the history of Florida? What are the big issues and big picture takeaways that you want our audience to know about your work?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for everybody for being here and for listening in. There's a few different takeaways I want to focus in on, which is number one is that we're not alone. And I mean that in a little bit of a different sense, because I think in a lot of ways, sometimes as historians, we tend to look at human engagement, human actions and so forth as the center of the things in which we do and things we learn. But by looking at animal studies, looking at environment and so forth, I think that we start to realize that we are players on a stage that involves a great many actors, and in this case, cattle. And I really kind of want to go back to a conversation I had with contemporary tribal member Moses Jumper back in 2017. A hurricane had just come through, and he and I are sitting on his front porch, and he says, "You know, Herb, we've always been cow people." And a lot of my work kind of focuses on this idea that Seminole Indians have always been cow people. And what does that mean to these ideas that the first cowboys in North America were actually Indians, and here in Florida, Florida Indians, right? So I kind of go back here and I'm looking at a few different situations here to understand that, you know, cattle really stood at the very center of Seminole struggles over place and identity in Florida in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And they were key to establishing Seminole communities, building those communities, and ultimately defending those communities from outside engagement. In this place, alternately called Fushki Yagne, Gon Fushki, Ichibolan, or Florida, as we know it today, right? And I want to look at these interactions because animals matter too, especially when we might look at contemporary issues over place, space, and belonging here in Florida. The questions over who's got rights to do what with what natural resources, and what does it mean when Seminoles say we've always been cattle people, especially when we consider that the Seminole Tribe of Florida has one of the largest cattle operations in the country right now today. So I'm looking specifically at two different situations here because early on in the establishment of the Alachua communities outside of present-day Gainesville, really kind of in this really nexus, this heartland, if you will, between the St. Johns River to the east and the Suwannee River to the west, are these vast plains upon which these feral Spanish cattle roamed by 1750. And there are thousands of them, tens of thousands, upon which early Seminole communities, led in part by Ahaya, otherwise known as Cowkeeper, capitalized upon. And these lands, this pasturage becomes very key to their domination of these lands. And not only their domination, but the planned domination by outsiders. Very early on, Seminoles in 1765, these Alachua communities find themselves caught between Lower Creek towns and the British as they start to barter between who's got right to these lands. Everyone seems to understand by this point in time that Florida's host to a new natural resource and these cattle that are really available unlike anywhere else. Deerskins and trade of deerskins is still popular, but people seem to understand that that's got a pretty finite term limit. If you look around the resources, people are already complaining by the 1760s, 1770s that the animals are getting hunted out. Everyone's talking about the deer becoming scarce and so forth. And there seems to be a real tension and a real fear that these animals are leaving the native South. Now, there are some still in Florida, but if you've ever hunted here in Florida, you'll know they're not as big as elsewhere in the South. They're about the size of a Labrador, it seems at times, and they simply just aren't the resource here that they were elsewhere. So people are kind of looking, when they're looking at Florida, as far as Florida's potential, they're looking at it in terms of pasturage. You simply don't grow things in central Florida like you do along the coast or maybe elsewhere in Georgia or Alabama or South Carolina. You can grow some rice on the St. Johns River, but into the interior, it's really about cattle. So what my paper kind of looks at are the alternating ways in which these Alachua communities kind of jockey between Lower Creek communities, the British, American entrepreneurs, for the control of these lands, because everyone seems to understand what's at stake here. So that's really where I'm kind of looking at. It's the ways in which these Seminoles, these early Seminoles, kind of use these lands to shape, define, and defend what comes to be their national territory and cultural identity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, almost Dr. Herbert. And next we're going to hear from Dr. James Hill, who's a visiting assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. His current book manuscript, which I hear is about to be published, is tentatively titled Creek Internationalism in an Age of Revolution, 1763 to 1818. The book focuses on Creek and Seminole efforts to defend their territorial and political power by forging transatlantic diplomatic networks, manipulating and appropriating European concepts of sovereignty, and participating in an international diplomatic community. And it will be published soon by the University of Nebraska Press. Dr. Hill will be talking to us about a project that emerges out of this book. And his article in the Florida Historical Quarterly is titled, "The Land We Live is Our Own, Indigenous Conceptions of Space in 18th Century Florida." Dr. Hill, I'm going to ask you the same question. For the non-specialist, what does your article tell us about the history of Florida? What are the big picture issues?
Thanks, Dr. Bossy. So what I want to start with is by alluding to Dr. Frank's introductory remarks and kind of reiterating what he was saying about how Florida history has come a long way. It has come a long way in terms of acknowledging and recognizing the presence of Indigenous peoples and the importance of Indigenous peoples. But I think a lot of what happens, especially the public perceptions of Florida history in the 17th century and in the 18th century, which is what I focus on, is that this is still predominantly a colonial history. The terms that are often used to refer to this period of Florida history define it by its European occupants. We have terms like the first Spanish period, the British period, the second Spanish period. And this framing still centers Europeans, which, as our other presenters have alluded to and mentioned, people who are very much a demographic minority and a geographic minority in Florida. What I want to do, and what I have done in this article, is talk a little bit about the kinds of spaces that Indigenous peoples created in 18th century Florida, and the ways in which they truly kind of shaped the landscape and truly were the people who determined what Florida is, and what outsiders experienced Florida as. So by centering Indigenous peoples, we get a sense of what the human landscape in Florida looked like throughout this period. And what I do in the article is, in two parts, I first talk about the types of spaces that Indigenous peoples created in Florida, the different kinds of space they imposed on the landscape. I range from talking about Indigenous communities such as towns and villages that Native peoples created and forged in Florida's landscape. I then talk about the connective tissue between these towns and villages, paths and roads that Indigenous people built, and a lot of times paths and roads that European peoples depended upon to travel between different points in Florida's territory. I talk about some of the resources that Indigenous peoples utilized and created and curated in Florida's landscape, the grazing areas that Dr. Herbert refers to for cattle, the ranches that Indigenous peoples constructed in Central Florida. I talk about hunting grounds for deer and other wild game that Indigenous peoples utilized and came to rely on throughout the 18th century. And then finally, I talk a bit about the colonial forts and towns themselves, the places that a lot of people in the public think of when they think of Florida in this period. Places like St. Augustine, places like Pensacola. And I try to reframe these places as places even of Indigenous power, because in the point of view of a lot of Indigenous people, these are sites that Europeans hold at Indigenous people's forbearance or even their desire to have European peoples among them. These forts and towns are thought of by many Indigenous people as spaces that are fundamentally theirs, that colonists are merely allowed to occupy as long as they meet certain conditions. And I get into a lot of this in the article where I talk about how Indigenous peoples can and do make demands of the occupants of these towns and forts. And they truly show that they are able to impose conditions on Europeans who like to think of themselves as the dominant force in this landscape. But if you look closely at the documentary record and you look closely at the historical record, you see, in fact, that Indigenous peoples really do impose a lot of conditions on Europeans and really do shape the ways in which they interact with the landscape and its people. So what I do in the second part of the article is I talk a little bit about that in particular. I go into how Indigenous leaders engaged with Europeans and how Indigenous leaders could shape and curate that colonial presence to their own benefit. How the colonial presence in Florida, in a lot of cases, was about trade and was about Indigenous people securing access to resources that they then used in their own internal concerns. For many Indigenous peoples, Spaniards and British colonists were of secondary concern. What a lot of Indigenous peoples in Florida were concerned about was their relationships with one another and how connections with Europeans could enhance those relationships. How certain towns who were struggling with towns further north that were attempting to impose their will upon them, towns such as Coweta and along the Chattahoochee River, were communities that Indigenous towns in Florida were trying to avoid having to defer to. And securing these connections with the outside world, diplomatic connections, economic connections, allowed Indigenous communities to secure more autonomy from other indigenous towns who maybe were seen as more powerful. But by forging their own connections to the outside world, indigenous communities in Florida were able to amplify their political voice. They were able to amplify their own ability to avoid relying on other indigenous communities. And they were able to assert their own autonomy in the spaces that comprised what we now think of as Florida: spaces along the Gulf Coast, spaces in the Florida Panhandle, spaces along the St. Johns River and in the Alachua Prairie. And so all of these spaces are crucially important to understanding what Florida is and was. And my article tries to get into a lot of this stuff to help explain just how we should be looking at Florida, and maybe how we can think of this as a space that's not defined by its colonial occupants, but as a space that's really about the indigenous peoples who made up the bulk of the people and the territory that is comprised of Florida. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Kristalyn Shefveland, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Southern Indiana, where she teaches courses on settler and indigenous America, the American South, and topics in colonial North America and the Atlantic world. Her first book was entitled Anglo-Native Virginia, Trade, Conversion, and Indian Slavery in the Old Dominion, 1646 to 1722, and was published in 2016 with the University of Georgia Press. Her second book project is tentatively entitled Old Florida, Yankee Settler Colonialism in the Land of the Ayes and Seminole, and it's currently under contract with the University Press of Florida. Her article in the Florida Historical Quarterly on Indigenous Florida comes out of this larger book project. That article is entitled Remembering an Indigenous South, Regional Identity, Vero Beach, and Settler Tourism. Dr. Shefveland, I'm going to ask you the same question. For the non-specialist, what does your article tell us about the history of Florida, and what are the big picture issues?
Well, the big picture is really glaringly obvious in my book project, is that I am taking on the concept of old Florida, and especially roadside old Florida and tourism towns. And so in my project on Vero Beach in the lower Indian River Valley, I'm taking a look at this luscious Indian River lagoon and the orange groves, and has just about everything you could possibly imagine. We've got wreckers, we've got pirates. If we're counting manatees, then we certainly have mermaids. And we, of course, have native peoples and a lot of fascinating characters, some of which are scoundrels. That's the heart of my project. And I came to the project, how does someone who's studying Virginia end up studying in Florida? It's because in the center of Vero Beach, overlooking the Pocahontas Park, is a beautiful mission-style building with a giant relief of Pocahontas on its second floor. Indeed, it had been the home of the Indian River Farms Company, which came out of Davenport, Iowa. And so I was very interested in understanding, what is this Spanish mission style, understanding, of course, all of the Moorish architecture of the 1920s. That made complete sense to me, but what is Pocahontas doing in Vero? Additionally, taking a look even further into the history, finding the Sleepy Eye Lodge, and okay, what is a Dakota doing in Vero? And naturally, we can, of course, connect back to Midwestern origins of many of the settlers. And that's how I got interested in the project, and trying to understand settler memory of Indigenous peoples, how they utilize both the actual past and this romanticized notion of Indigenous people, particularly in the case of Indigenous women like Pocahontas. But Vero has its own very long Indigenous history. Those who are more familiar with Vero, of course, have heard of Vero man, although there is a lot of debate as if it were Vero man or women, but we will not get into that today. But this long, long history, as well as the Ayes and the Seminole. So why are they not a part of the story that boosters are selling to tourists and to would-be settlers? And why are they not a part of the major story for Vero even to today? That's part of what I'm examining. And so the article that I worked on for this collection is taking a look at why and who is most involved. And so going back to and understanding, there's the two ways that people view Florida, of course. People either love Florida, it's idyllic and it's perfect and it's paradise, or it's the other way that people view Florida, the absolute opposite. I'm looking at the Edenic conception and taking a look at how settlers and boosters responded to the findings of Indigenous remains that became known collectively as Vero Man, the creation of a Tarzan Park that obfuscates entirely the actual Indigenous past of the region, but instead focusing on Vero Beach as the Garden of Eden, and including some sort of African conceptions of this past alongside saber-toothed tigers, and you can participate in your own little dig. And that culminates though in a project by a settler and booster that I work with very, very closely in the larger project, a man by the name of Waldo Sexton. Waldo Sexton is actually from Indiana, interestingly enough, received his degree from Purdue, ended up in Cleveland, where he became a salesperson for a Spalding tilling plant and brought down a hoe. It didn't work out in the sandy soil of Vero, but it gave him the opportunity to see the land, and he spent nearly his last dime, according to him. His stories are fantastical. We have to leave a little bit of room to suspend disbelief because they're so fascinating. But he was a man that had grown up and was very much influenced by the world's expositions, in particular the St. Louis exposition. He had in his mind's eye a memory of that event, and he sought to recreate that event in the jungle garden that he created alongside Arthur McKee, alongside US 1 in Vero. Back in the day, the jungle garden took up nearly the entirety of what is now South Vero, and was an elaborate garden that included a chickie and a Seminole man by the name of Louis Tucker. And part of what I'm uncovering in my research is the role of the Seminole in creating this space at the McKee Garden, and what Waldo is imagining when he's talking about Old Florida. When he's talking about Old Florida, he's frequently focusing on Spanish colonial Florida and an imagining of Spanish colonial Florida. And a lot of it comes specifically from Addison Meisner. Waldo liked to go and pillage the ruins of Palm Beach mansions and to save them. As one person described it, he created Waldo texture because he would put together driftwood, he would put together materials that he had gotten at auction. He went all the way through the world collecting examples of Spanish mission. So at the jungle garden, he actually has a Lady of Guadalupe bell, which is right outside of the Hall of Giants. And this is the Old Florida that he is presenting. But remembering that Waldo is telling a story of a fictitious past, mired in these romantic settler notions of Native peoples and the colonial past. And the origins of the items that he is collecting can be dubious at best. So I want to share one little quote from his son, Ralph, who is talking about going through the Driftwood Resort that they had on the coast. One day, my father was taking some women through the Driftwood Inn, and he was telling them how he had acquired each item they came across. He was really laying it on, and the women were fascinated. One of them was so interested, she came back that afternoon while he was talking and taking another group around. To her surprise, some of the stories he was telling didn't jive with what she had heard earlier. "Mr. Sexton," she remonstrated, "that's not what you said this morning." And he replied, "Madam, I'd rather be a liar than a bore." And so my article is deconstructing some of the origins of the Driftwood and the Jungle Garden, and the larger project is taking on settler memory writ large. Thank you.
Well, that was great. Thank you all. Let me ask the next question. Now, I'm going to premise this by saying I'm predisposed to see Native people everywhere, right? And I think all of us exist in that world. But obviously we have generations of scholars before us, smart, intelligent, hardworking, going to the sources, pouring through archives that don't see, right, what I now see is obvious. We have one paper that talks about 20 Spaniards in a world of thousands of Indians somehow being dominant. We can obviously see through another paper that, while most of Florida was hunting grounds or cattle herds, or right places where indigenous people were prevalent and Spaniards or English were not. And then we finally get to Vero Beach, where lo and behold, there's like a Pocahontas lodge right next to where Seminole man and community are living. So is this, I guess, this is a long way of asking, how on earth do we explain Native people hiding in plain sight throughout Florida's entire history? Is this a function of sources, or is this a function of, say, the power of received wisdom? So is it something in your source space that allowed you to see it, or did you just have to open your eyes to the same source space other people have been looking at?
I guess I can start here. I don't think it's a question of source space, because when I talk to tribal members today, they'll tell you the same thing that my article is largely about, which is that Seminoles have always been cow people, and their history is rooted in the earth and their labor in it, and their sovereignty is really written on rawhide. The tribe itself has largely through its museum and elders been responsible for pushing these stories forward, and anyone willing to go and listen can hear these things and also amplify those voices. Where I come in is maybe adding a little bit of historical flair through looking at some of the treaties and so forth, but those stories I think have really kind of always been there if people are willing to listen. I just don't think that we've really been looking to maybe Native folks to see this traditional ecological knowledge that folks have been talking about for years and years and years.
Well, let me press you on this almost, Dr. Herbert, right? So I think the answer then, if Seminoles have been saying this all along, then the answer is we haven't been looking as a discipline to the right sources. But your paper, to play up what I think the strength of your paper is, your strength of your paper is not just that Seminoles are saying this all along, but William Bartram says it all along, right? And we've read every Florida literature and history class assigns Bartram. So how have generations of Bartram scholars missed it, right? Everyone knows Cowkeeper.
I think people have been, missing the forest for all the beeves, for lack of a better expression. I've been working on that one, folks. I think in a lot of ways, the stories that we want that have been told about the United States, American exceptionalism and so forth, have really kind of focused in on these colonial aspects and this heroistic stories. Dr. Shefveland talks about old Florida, right? I think Dr. Hill and I are kind of disputing the notion of a bold Florida, of this idea of this romantic Spanish idea that we all know there was no gold in Florida, but what we do know is what was being sold here in Florida, which were cattle and deer, and they were being sold by Native peoples, right? But that does go against these stories that maybe people wanted to tell that enrich their own cultural identity. I think people want to tell the histories that reflect their own beliefs about themselves, not only as perhaps people, but as a nation. And I think maybe that's where maybe those historians, believe it or not, are also people too, despite what we want to think about them. So they're just as subject to those foibles, I think, as anyone else.
Can I jump in here real quick too? Sure. So I want to echo what Dr. Herbert was saying, almost Dr. Herbert. I think Indigenous people are everywhere in the sources, even the written records that are compiled and authored by Europeans. The problem is, I think a lot of times we're preconditioned to ignore those glaring clues and that glaring evidence to focus on what emphasizes received wisdom, what emphasizes conditional knowledge. It doesn't help that we're enamored with maps that show neatly delineated and neatly bounded territories. And it's a lot easier to just take the maps that Europeans have created that show these giant swaths of Spanish or British territory and utilize those. I see this all the time, even when myself and some of my colleagues are doing work that outreaches to the public. Everyone wants to have a nice image, a nice map to put on the screen. And it takes a lot of work to try to step in and say, well, hold on, that map actually isn't adequate because it just shows North America as French and Spanish and British space, right? And so I think these visual cues that we often use to talk about history and teach history sometimes hinder this message because it still preconditions European colonial domination or tales of European colonial domination, visions of European colonial domination. So that preconceived wisdom, that received wisdom, that preconceived notion, expecting to find Europeans dominating this space and Europeans, or conversely, some of these indigenous spaces to be just empty. A lot of the European language that tries to justify subsequent colonial actions does so by framing indigenous dominated space as empty wilderness. And I think that language has seeped into a lot of the public consciousness as well. Whereas vast stretches of North America are thought of as places without people, or people who don't have what Americans often thought of as quote unquote civilization. And I think that's kind of a lot of what all of us are trying to do is militate against that mindset and show how to reorient how we're looking at things.
I'd love to hop in quickly too, to just sort of add to what y'all have said already. I exclusively in this project am looking at the 16th and 17th century. So I'm looking at, the very, very earliest sort of period of Florida history. And part of when, I'm working very much in a source base that is written by colonists, written by Spanish friars, written by officials. Later, by the sort of end of the 17th century, we get some sources that are actually produced by Indigenous people who are either dictating in their language or even writing in Spanish. So one thing I sort of found doing this work is I'm returning to really a lot of these written sources that other scholars have looked at before me in other projects, and sort of finding that we really need to take seriously that our authors of these sources are people with their own motivations, right? They have their own goals, they have their own assumptions, they have their own sort of cultural expectations, as Dr. Hill gestured to as well. And really, these authors are often, they're writing these documents that we're looking at for this early period for the crown. They're trying to convince the crown that they're doing a good job, that things are going well. They're trying to get specific things. They are, also often coming to Florida with earlier colonial experiences. A lot of them have been in Latin America. So they come with these assumptions of what sort of societies they're interacting with that don't always apply in a Florida context. So sort of sometimes as historians, we need to go into these sources and sort of take a step back and think about our authors themselves as people with motivations, with interests, with biases, and sort of through that able to see that often these authors might say in a document that, oh, we have control here, we're in charge, but then 2 sentences later say, if we don't keep these chiefs really happy, we're in trouble. So even in their own sources, often they are contradicting themselves because what is actually happening on the ground is kind of bubbling through, despite the rosy picture that might be wanting to paint. So sometimes it really is just a question of sort of really reading these sources in a different way and trying to see how we can pull these biases apart, kind of understand the underlying reality on the ground.
I'm looking at time period in which people have been remarkably influenced by generations of scholarship that have created a very significant problem of deliberately obfuscating what was directly in front of them. So a lot of the sources that I'm looking at will talk about how there are no Seminole in the region and then talk about the Seminole being in Vero Beach on Saturday. Talk about there's no examples of the Seminole being anywhere near this farm, and then talk about examples of, well, we knew that they had been there when we saw certain tracks and the gopher tortoises. What? It's maddening, but it's also something that I am trying to understand. I think we need to understand is that it is not just a Florida problem, it's an American history problem of this idea. We have a last Indian problem. We have a vanishing Indian problem. We have a choice over the so-called good Indian, the noble Indian. It's very telling that Vero Beach has a lot about Osceola, and Osceola has absolutely nothing to do with Vero Beach. And there's very little mention of any Seminole that were involved in the Lower Indian River Lagoon. They are not valorized. They don't have statues named up for them or buildings named for them. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. But that who they're choosing to valorize are those, and who they're choosing to focus on are often those who had been helpful to white settlers, whether it was in Florida or whether it was part of their Midwestern past. They're also very deliberately not choosing to focus on their Southern past. They're taking a look and they're jumping all the way back into their imagined Spanish colonial past and ignoring all the details of the Ayes polity while doing so. So they're very deliberate decisions is what I'm considering here, and to talk about. And again, this is a Florida problem. It's an American problem. I would call back to Amanda Bryan's great article in Southern Cultures from 2014 about the villages, where she talks extensively about the Disney realism, where you have like a hint of truth sanitized to privilege a history of white Americans and those of European descent, sanitizing the history of a region, a common strategy to present, because people are interested in history. But oftentimes town planners and commissions seek to present a history that's palatable and comfortable, as opposed to working in the nuances of what actually happened.
That was great.
That was really good. Thanks all of you. Those were some really important points. We have about 15 or 20 minutes left. And so we thought in these last moments, what we would do is sort of begin to think big picture about indigenizing Florida history. And so Dr. Frank and I are also going to jump into this part of the discussion. We have an introduction to the Florida Historical Quarterly Special Issue, where we begin to grapple with what we hope folks take away from the issue at large, and the ways in which we hope to challenge how Florida history is taught, and also how Florida historians go about conducting research on Indigenous people. And part of our goal too is to really engage with the public. It's crucial to think about how we teach Florida history to fourth graders. It's crucial to think about how we represent Florida history in our state and national parks, and our local museums, and at our local historical societies. And this is work that we're very much engaged with. And this is where we also want to see, big spaces made for Indigenous history. So I thought I'd just start by talking a little bit about one of the big takeaways that I hope we can pull out of this session, and then open it up to whoever else would like to talk. And what's come up in the last question a lot is sources and the power of the archive. And for those who do or don't read archival sources, the evidence that we're talking about is often right there. And so I'm going to offer two examples. In 1763, when the British enter St. Augustine, they immediately engage in imperial mapping. And this is really critical to them, trying to not only control Florida, but also to consolidate their imperial holdings more generally at the end of the French and Indian War. And a British engineer is in St. Augustine, and he says, we can't get out to do any mapping because the Indigenous people have hemmed us in and they won't let us map. And so as much as we're talking about Spaniards and British and American writers controlling the archive, we also have to think about the ways in which Indigenous people, by controlling space and controlling relationships, are also controlling the archive, right? In this case, preventing the mapping of their communities. And then there are those moments of erasure, like in 1778, when Joseph Purcell goes on another British effort to map space, to map Florida. He includes a lot of so-called Seminole towns. And then he ends by saying on his map, there are other small villages that I'm just not going to tell you about. And then there are also other Indigenous spaces that I'm just not going to visit, and I didn't go to. But here's a map that represents British Florida, or the road in this case from Pensacola to St. Augustine. So the archives are a way in which we can work through and recover Indigenous people, because they're there, controlling the archive, engaging with those who are creating archives, And another key way in which we can find and resurrect Indigenous voices is by thinking also more broadly about what our sources look like. So Dr. Herbert, I'm going to just call you Dr. Herbert now. I'm asserting that you are going to pass your defense with no problem. Dr. Herbert works closely with Seminole informants, and that shapes his work. He sees himself as very much engaged in a community partnership when he does his work. There's also a call for thinking about things like Indigenous language, which many folks don't work with, for thinking about the way in which Indigenous people shaped land and the land itself as a form of archive. More sort of close at hand, Florida historians have a long history of working with archaeologists. And archaeological sites, Indigenous archaeological sites, are Indigenous archives, especially when we move beyond just looking for Spanish features and actually move into Indigenous spaces. Those are also archival materials. So now I want to open it up. I could talk forever and ask you what you think Florida history should look like for everybody out there.
I'm happy to start, since I think I have the earliest paper for this project, which you know, my sort of thing I just always want to emphasize to, you know, historians or teachers or anyone who's just interested in Florida history is that Florida is very much an Indigenous world, and it is an Indigenous world well into the Spanish colonial period. You know, my work is very much focused on the Panhandle in particular, but this is something that certainly is applying in Florida more broadly. And there's often this sort of misconception that missions were the end of Indigenous power in Florida, and that is absolutely not the case. Often, as my paper tries to show in this special issue, missions were often part of Indigenous power. They were not representative of the end of it. They were in fact part of the power that chiefs were able to exercise, the ways they were able to use their allies, Indigenous as well as Spanish, to their own advantage. And so again, Dr. Hill sort of mentioned this as well earlier, but this idea of like thinking of this period as the first Spanish period really is a fallacy. This is not in any meaningful sense reflecting how power works on the ground. And I think that's something as we teach or study Florida is so important to keep in mind, this persistence of Indigenous power, this persistence of Florida as certainly an Indigenous space.
So I would say one thing to think about is to think maybe of European presence as somewhat ephemeral, and that could help ground Indigenous people as the center of this story. So to go back to what Dr. Bossy was saying about the end of the French and Indian War, a lot of the sources I look at, and I talk about this in the article, when Spanish colonists are preparing to evacuate their colonial outposts in Florida at the end of that conflict, Indigenous people are coming up to these forts angry and telling them, you don't have the right to give this land over to the British. You don't have the right to just turn over this fort. We told you could have this fort here, but it's not yours, right? You're here at our forbearance, basically. And then, as Dr. Bossy alluded to, when the British arrive, Indigenous peoples are telling the British, no, you can't do X, Y, Z. You can't go out and map. In some cases, you can't go out and gather food, right? And I think those examples kind of highlight just kind of how this European presence is really small and beleaguered, and in a lot of cases, fairly insignificant. And I think flipping around how we think of this space and how we think the people that occupy it is a good way to try to change how we think of Florida during this time period, to just simply show how Europeans are kind of coming and going with regularity, and they're constantly frustrated in just about anything they try to accomplish here. So I think what that does is kind of show us where the true power lies in this region. And it kind of gives us a window into understanding this region a little better.
I think what becomes key for me, at least for my own research, when I talk to folks about what it is that I do and so forth, is emphasizing that there is a tremendous archive available to people about Indigenous history from Indigenous people here in Florida themselves. The Seminole Tribe of Florida operates a tremendous tribal historic preservation office that works to preserve and tell Seminole stories, as well as those of before the tribe came to be, of their ancestors. And furthermore, right, there's also a tremendous museum at the Atahigi on Big Cypress Seminole Indian Reservation that is open to the public. So whether you are a historian or fan of history or just a fan of Florida itself, Florida begins in indigenous hands, right? There's, I talked to tribal members. The tribe has been very, people I've spoken to in the tribe are very clear. The tribe is never leaving Florida, right? So when we consider that, I think we have to understand that the tribe in Florida are really linked in ways that we need to reconceptualize. And that may be, and Dr. Hill was just talking about the European experience as ephemeral, right? I think we need to understand that for tribal members, both in the past and the present. The past is still very much going on right now today. This is a story that continues to evolve. We're in the middle of that history when we think about it. So I would encourage folks to go and see those native sources and those native archives for themselves. The tribe has been very open about making those available to researchers and so forth. So go and hear from them.
And the museum is a wonderful resource. Yeah. Dr. Shefveland, do you want to add anything? Or I'll let Dr. Frank jump in.
All right, so let me jump in. I'm going to reiterate I'm just going to echo what you've all said. So when we come to phrases like first or second Spanish period, we all bristle. But I want to revisit the idea of sources. Right, and I'll tell it from the vantage point of curriculum. At FSU, before I got here, Florida history was split in 1821. The premise being prior to 1821 was Latin American history, and after 1821, it was US history. But we can also think of lots of literature that does the same thing, that we are often trained to go to a set of sources. And when those set of sources end, our story ends. So when the Spanish evacuate, the story comes to an end. We've all read the tale of Pick the Mission. The last Tequesta was evacuated in, or the last Calusa was evacuated in. Whereas the presumption is that missionized Indians are all the Indians. And when the source space disappears, and therefore we don't have the window onto the people that we're studying, therefore the people aren't there. But I think when we express that to our students, they can understand that right away. And I think part of the story now is about, for me, the big takeaway is we're studying the past, we're not studying the sources. We're using sources to get at our questions, but we're not examining the papeles de Cuba to see what they have to say about something. We're examining something and then seeing what we can have. And my great joy in reading your 4 papers and watching them develop is to see how you deal with source bases that are really incomplete, whether they come to an end or they obviously don't say things, and how we can look to other sources, whether they be indigenous or otherwise, to find ways to kind of like make silences not silent anymore.
Well, and I would add that people are interested in knowing the full story, but it can be fun to sort of, I take Washington Irving as an example, and I've been playing with him a lot in my survey courses as well. And I explore him in the greater book to talk about myths in Florida. But these ideas that we have about American history, where do they come from? And to play with and to understand how they came from the 19th century, how they came from as early as a crazy source from Ione about Carolina being another Andalusia. Of course, it's not. But these early sources all the way up into the present pop culture, where are these ideas coming from? And then it can be fun to work with students to deconstruct. What is this telling us about the era in which it was created? How does it then get propagated into this larger myth? How does it become part of roadside Americana? Why are there competing fountains of youth in Florida? Was there any search for a fountain of youth? Probably not. Did he land in Melbourne? Yes. I just threw down the gauntlet there. But these ideas, and to play with them and to deconstruct them, can be a lot of fun in class, because students are walking in with preconceived notions, or they have no notions about it whatsoever. And then they're like, I had no idea that anybody thought these things. And then to bring in the sources, and it can be a really lively discussion, even as young as elementary school.
I completely agree. And I'll give you the one version I have 3 kids and they all went through the same 4th grade curriculum. And maybe even 3rd grade before Florida history, they were doing a Native American unit. And they were all basically told, pick one of these 6 tribes and create a diorama. What do they live? Well, where do they live? What do they wear? What do they eat? What do their houses look like? Right, your 6 or 7 generic questions. And the presumption would be that Indians lived in the past. And so, of course, my oldest son, who did this first, he came to me, I'm going to pick Seminoles because Dad knows a lot about the Seminoles. And I looked at him and I said, well, I got a picture of this great home that I just took when I was at the Brighton Reservation. And it was a 2-story cinder block constructed home with Spanish tile roof with a swimming pool in the back. It's a beautiful home. And he looked at me at the age of whatever, single digits. He says, Dad, that's not what the teacher wants. He knew instinctively that what the teacher was asking, there better be a chickpea there. There has to be a fire. There should be corned beans and squash, and it should be patchwork, even if those different things didn't coexist at the same time. I took out like museum exhibits for him. Like, pick the picture that you like, because if you want to have like alligator wrestling, which is what he really wanted, you can't have other things at the same time, right? But when I talk to teachers about like, can they at least put a date on when this diorama is supposed to take place? That was as if I was asking them to like transform the earth and make it flat. Like there was no way. But for my kids and the kids in the class, they know this, right? They come to this with a different set of biases that I think at least my generation and maybe the rest of our generations come to it.
Well, and then they often go into public spaces, and the more complicated idea that your children are carrying in are flattened, right? So and I'm in Northeast Florida, I teach at the University of North Florida, and if you go to our local museums, the narrative is the Timucuas hadn't changed for 500 or 1,000 years. I mean, they literally say this. Then Europeans arrived who were very modern, whether they were French or Spanish, and then Indians just disappeared, largely from epidemics. And so that mantra is sort of told and recycled over and over in public spaces ad nauseum. And I love Dr. Shefveland's notion that we need to bring our students into this deconstructive work. And I would agree that students are really excited about it. We're currently tackling the Fort Caroline mythology, which is going to get a lot of people mad at us, but the students are thrilled. You know, that's a mythology that starts in the night. It starts earlier, but is reified in the 1950s. And it comes out of a very specific moment, a very particular construction of the past for very distinct reasons. And the students are so excited to get into that and to deconstruct that mythologizing and figure out both what the Indigenous story looks like, how did Indigenous people understand this encounter, and also why was this myth created at the time that it was, and why is it still today showcased at this national park as the sort of centerpiece of Jacksonville history. So I love that idea of bringing students into that. I think that's really important. Any other big takeaways that we want folks to take away from this? So I'm hearing Indigenous people didn't just disappear at the moment of contact or disappear, you know, in the 18th century. Creeks did not magically, we would also want folks to know, did not magically become Seminoles when they crossed some imaginary border into Florida, that there's a much richer history there of Indigenous interaction. The Seminoles themselves recognize the long Indigenous history of this space and claim that as part of their past too. Other big takeaways?
I would say for people that they should be aware that Native people don't just miraculously reappear when it is convenient for the storytellers, right? Somehow the Native people in Florida disappear until all of a sudden we have a long 3 Seminole Wars, often disappear in the times in between, unless something happens that allows us or wants us to start writing about it.
I think Indigenous peoples are doing other things when they're not fighting with Americans.
Yeah, and Shefveland's piece on Vero, right? They're right there the whole time. And if they make for a good story, they're part of the story. But if they don't make for a good story, forget even fighting. If they don't make for a good story, they're inconvenient and on the margins.
Do we also want to challenge the idea of who Floridians were and are? and how that's cast in our histories of the past?
Yes.
Just yes. I would add that this is just the beginning, right? This work that we've done together in the Florida Historical Quarterly, this special issue on Indigenous Florida, comes out of wanting to respond to what has become a predominant tendency not to focus on Indigenous people at all in Florida history, and that this is just the beginning. Every member of our panel has a book forthcoming on Indigenous Florida. Dr. Frank is working on a book on the Seminoles. I'm working on a book on the Yamasees. And everyone else, you've heard about their work. This is all coming out, and we're not alone. There are many other folks working on Indigenous Florida. So if this is of interest to you, think of this panel, this special issue, as just the beginning. And one of our big hopes is that whether or not you do Indigenous history, that you now begin to pay attention to Indigenous people as you think about Florida and create narratives that center them as well as other folks. I often say Pedro Menendez himself would not recognize how we tell the history of Florida. William Bartram would not recognize how we tell the history of Florida, because they too understood how central Indigenous people were to this space. Even those who erased Indigenous people nonetheless in some way made note of their power. And that's often what we're talking about, is geopolitical power. And the need to center Indigenous people and to recognize the power that they often held and continue to hold over Florida territory. Dr. Frank, any last thoughts?
I want to thank everyone for their great papers and for agreeing to be part of this roundtable. And I would take it one step further, and I think this is a call of arms, not to the audience as a whole, but I think it's a call to arms to other scholars. And I'm going to use this as an opportunity to present what I think is our collective pet peeve that sometimes we don't want to say in public. It's about time scholars of modern Florida, modern being anywhere from, say, 1800 to the present, acknowledge that Native people are here and have had and continue to have a really profound influence. It is frustrating and maddening to hear about the history of tourism in Florida and not see Seminoles or Miccosukes at its center. It is maddening to hear about the history of slavery in Florida and have Seminole component of that being one chapter, not integrated into the whole. It is maddening to hear about Jim Crow, which is a great, important topic in Florida, and not try to imagine, as say Lowry did for the Lumbee, what this means in Florida. Right? We can go to all the major urban areas and all the major rural areas of Florida, and there has been an Indigenous presence throughout. And it is, for whatever reason, been acceptable amongst our peers to not acknowledge that. Yeah, mic drop.
That's perfect. There it goes. So I think we'll end there. Thank you all so much for coming. We so appreciate all the hard work that you've done and your willingness to share that work with us, both here and in the Florida Historical Quarterly special issue. And we hope that everyone buys your book when it comes out, whether that is soon or a few years from now.